Imagine this. A 7-year-old walks home from school alone, lets themselves into an empty house, and makes their own dinner before either parent gets home. No phone to check in, no app tracking their location, just a key on a string around their neck. It sounds like a scene from a movie, but for an entire generation, this was just Tuesday. They're called Generation X, the kids born roughly between 1965 and 1980. But here's the strange part. Almost nobody agrees on who they actually are. Ask a boomer, and you'll get one answer. Ask a millennial, and you'll get a completely different one. Ask Gen Z, and the answer changes again. Gen X is the generation that keeps shape-shifting depending on who's looking at them. And that, it turns out, might be the most interesting thing about them. The silent generation and the boomers. To the parents who raised them, Gen X looked like a problem nobody meant to create. Divorce rates in America more than doubled between the late 1960s and early 1980s. Mothers entered the workforce in record numbers. And somewhere in the middle of that shift, millions of children were left to raise themselves. Sociologists even gave them a nickname, the Latchkey Generation. Some studies estimate that by the early 1980s, up to 40% of school-age kids in America were coming home to an empty house. The parents who created this situation didn't see it as neglect, though. They saw independence. To boomers, an unsupervised kid wasn't a red flag, it was proof the system was working. Go outside. Figure it out. Be back by streetlight. There was no hovering, no scheduling, no constant check-ins. And so, to the generation above them, Gen X became defined by a single trait, self-reliance, whether they wanted it or not. That single trait would end up shaping everything that came next. But there's a darker layer underneath that nickname. Being called latchkey wasn't just a description, it was a diagnosis. Newspapers in the 1980s ran headlines warning that an entire generation was being raised by television instead of parents. Talk shows debated whether Gen X would even know how to function as adults. The generation above them looked at empty houses and afternoon cartoons and predicted disaster. None of it came true. That same generation grew up to become some of the most self-sufficient adults in modern history. They learned to cook because no one was cooking for them. They learned to solve problems because no one was solving them first. What boomers saw as a crisis, Gen X turned into a skill set. Millennials. To the generation born right after them, Gen X looks like something almost mythical, the cool aunt or uncle who doesn't try too hard and somehow still seems more relaxed than anyone else in the room. Millennials grew up watching Gen X navigate the world with a kind of detached confidence that felt impossible to fake. No anxiety about missing out, no need for approval, just quiet competence. But here's the twist. That confidence wasn't really calm, it was armor. A generation raised without supervision, without participation trophies, without anyone checking their homework, learned early that nobody was coming to save them, so they stopped asking. Millennials, raised with far more parental involvement and far more praise, often mistake this survival skill for effortless cool. It isn't effortless. It was built the hard way, one empty house at a time. And there's something else millennials inherited without realizing it. Gen X built the internet's early foundations, the forums, the designs, the garage bands who recorded their own albums because no label would sign them. That do-it-yourself instinct became the blueprint for an entire generation of millennial entrepreneurs and creators who never even knew where the habit came from. The word adulting itself only exists because of that gap. The entire concept, the running joke about not knowing how to file taxes or make a doctor's appointment, only exists because millennials were raised with so much more support than the generation before them. Gen X didn't have a word for adulting. They just had Tuesday again. Gen Z skip ahead another generation, and the picture shifts again. To Gen Z, Gen X barely registers as a distinct identity at all. They show up online mostly as a meme, the deadpan, sarcastic adult in the comment section who refuses to explain the joke, flannel shirts, monotone voices, a complete unwillingness to perform enthusiasm for anyone. But here's what most people miss. That refusal to perform isn't apathy, it's philosophy. Gen X came of age during a media landscape that constantly tried to sell them something, and their defining cultural response was to reject it outright. Grunge music, slacker films, an entire aesthetic built around not caring what anyone thought. Gen Z, raised inside algorithms that reward constant self-presentation, finds this almost incomprehensible. An entire generation that refused to brand itself. To them, it looks like rebellion. To Gen X, it was never a stance, it was just Tuesday. There's a quieter irony here, too. Gen Z's obsession with authenticity, the demand for realness over polish, is essentially the same instinct Gen X had 30 years earlier. They just didn't put a hashtag on it. If you want to see this pattern in its purest form, look at how Gen X handled fame itself. Kurt Cobain famously hated being called the voice of a generation. Winona Ryder avoided the press circuit that most stars chased. The biggest icons of the era treated visibility as a burden, not a reward. To a generation raised on personal brands and follower counts, that instinct looks almost alien. To Gen X, wanting to be famous was suspicious. If you were trying too hard to be noticed, something was probably wrong with you. Gen Alpha. Now travel one generation further, and something strange happens. Gen X disappears almost entirely from view. To Gen Alpha, the children born after 2010, Gen X isn't a cultural reference point at all. They're grandparents. The people who show up at holidays, hand out old-fashioned advice, and still somehow know how to fix a printer without calling anyone for help. Here's the part that surprises people, though. That generation who once seemed invisible, sandwiched between two much louder cohorts, turned out to raise some of the most closely supervised children in history. The latchkey kids became the helicopter parents. The generation nobody checked in on became obsessed with checking in on everyone. It's one of the strangest reversals in modern parenting history, and almost nobody talks about it. The very absence Gen X grew up with became the thing they refused to repeat. Researchers have a term for this kind of pattern: generational overcorrection, where the exact thing a generation lacked becomes the thing they overprovide for their own kids. Gen X lived it in real time, without ever naming it. They didn't read a study about attachment theory before deciding to walk their kids to the bus stop every single morning. They remembered what it felt like to walk there alone. Every generation sees Gen X through a different lens, and every single one is only partly right. To boomers, they were an accident of independence. To millennials, an unattainable cool built on hidden hardship. To Gen Z, a meme stripped of its original meaning. To Gen Alpha, barely visible at all. But underneath every version, the same thread keeps showing up: self-reliance. Whether it's called neglect, coolness, apathy, or old-fashioned wisdom, it always traces back to the same origin point: a generation raised with a key around their neck and nobody waiting at home. And maybe that's the real reason Gen X is so hard to pin down. They were shaped in the gap between two generations that both got more attention than they did, and instead of demanding to be seen, they quietly adapted. They built the internet's earliest communities without asking for credit. They created entire music and film movements built on refusing to sell out. They raised the most protected generation of children in history, almost as an apology to their younger selves. Think about how strange that arc actually is. A generation raised on empty houses and no supervision grew up to invent the search engines, social platforms, and always-on technology that now make it nearly impossible for any child to ever be truly unsupervised again. Gen X didn't just adapt to their own upbringing, they engineered the tools that made sure the next generation would never have to experience it the same way. Nobody planned that. It just happened, decade by decade, one overlooked choice at a time. There's also a financial twist that rarely gets mentioned. Gen X hit the workforce right as pensions started disappearing and 401k plans became the norm, right as housing prices began climbing faster than wages, right as 2 recessions in 20 years wiped out savings just as they were being built. They're sometimes called the forgotten generation in wealth studies for exactly this reason. Sandwiched between boomers who bought homes for a fraction of today's prices and millennials who at least got talked about constantly in the media. Gen X didn't get the headlines. They absorbed the impact and kept moving. Every generation eventually gets defined by someone else's story about them. Boomers get remembered for the world they built. Millennials get remembered for the world they inherited and tried to fix. Gen Z gets remembered for growing up online. But Gen X never fits neatly into anyone else's narrative, and maybe that was always the point. So which version is the real one? The neglected kid, the cool relative, the deadpan meme, the overprotective parent? Maybe the answer is that they were never just one of these things. Maybe the real story of Gen X isn't about how any single generation saw them. It's about the one thing every single generation, without exception, ended up admitting. Whatever else you say about them, they figured it out on their own.